Good afternoon. I'm Amanda Janino, Vice President, Business Development for IDSA and the IDSA Foundation. Welcome and thank you for joining us for today's non-CME webinar in the Dr. John G. Bartlett Memorial Series, where we'll be exploring recurrent C. diff using real-world data to guide treatment strategies. We are so grateful to Ferring Pharmaceuticals for supporting this program. Thank you. Before I turn the program over to our host and moderator, I have a few housekeeping matters. This webinar is being recorded and will be available on demand. A link will be emailed to all registrants within 3 business days, or you may access a recording and share it via our website and the IDSA Foundation YouTube channel. You'll notice that your microphones are automatically muted. There will be a dedicated Q&A session at the end of the presentation today. If we can't get to all of your questions during the live event, we'll do our very best to address them in a follow-up email. Now, I would like to welcome back our moderator for today, Dr. Shweta Anjan. Dr. Anjan is an Associate Professor of Clinical Medicine at the University of Miami Miller School of Medicine and Miami Transplant Institute. She has completed her Infectious Diseases and Transplant Infectious Diseases Fellowships at the University of Miami-Jackson Memorial Hospital before joining the faculty. She is also the program director for the Transplant Infectious Disease Fellowship Program. Her areas of interest include medical education, clinical research, and patient advocacy. She is an active member of education and mentoring committees for IDSA and the American Society of Transplantation. Dr. Anjan, welcome. We are so glad to have you.
Thank you. Thank you, Amanda, for that kind introduction, and thank you for having me here today. Good afternoon, everyone. I'd also like to highlight that I'm actually also part of the Rising Leaders Program of IDSA and part of the newly formed IDSA Leadership Institute Alumni Advisory Panel. And the IDSA Leadership Programs is something I recommend to all mentees and junior faculty, as I found it really helpful. For my clinical practice, I predominantly practice with transplant and immunocompromised hosts, and this group is particularly vulnerable to recurrent C. diff infections, so I couldn't be happier to moderate the session today. We have a lot of ground to cover, so I would like to move on to our objectives. So today we will be discussing the epidemiology of recurrent C. diff infections, including the population at most risk and the risk presented by antibiotics. We will review the current incidence rates, mortality rates, hospital quality metrics, and medical costs of recurrent infection in the United States. We'll describe the physiologic role of the microbiome and the need to address dysbiosis in recurrent infections. Evaluate the evidence for GMT treatment using real-world evidence and provide patient educational points on discharge to prevent the spread of C. diff and decrease occurrences of recurrence. Identify strategies to incorporate current evidence and best practices for managing recurrent infections into clinical practice, focusing on the healthcare team's role in decreasing incidence. We will also be discussing the impact of recurrent infections on patient quality of life, and we will be hearing from a patient advocate who has been treated for recurrent infections in the past. Now it is my pleasure to introduce our first speaker, a distinguished expert and leader in infectious diseases, Dr. Tina Chopra. Dr. Chopra is the Assistant Dean of Faculty Development and Coaching and a Professor of Medicine in the Division of Infectious Diseases at Wayne State University. She is also the Corporate Medical Director of Hospital Epidemiology, Infection Prevention, and Antibiotic Stewardship at Detroit Medical Center. Her research interests include epidemiology of healthcare-associated infections, infection prevention, antibiotic stewardship, and immunization. Dr. Chopra has published over 90 papers in various journals and book chapters. Additionally, she has independently reviewed over 60 journal articles. Dr. Chopra has a special interest in immunization and studying the epidemiology of infections, which include Clostridium difficile and multi-drug resistant organisms. She has championed the mammoth task of leading the COVID-19 pandemic for Wayne State University and Detroit Medical Center. She's currently serving on the President's COVID Task Force and on the President's Public Health Committee. She has appeared on countless media and print interviews, including for CNN, Fox News, NPR, and Time magazine. She was a fellow of the Executive Leadership Academy of Medicine in 2022 and 2023. Dr. Chopra is a certified executive coach and has extensive experience in coaching and mentoring trainees and faculty. Dr. Chopra is truly a star. Welcome today, and thank you for speaking to us.
Thank you, Dr. Anjan, for the nice introduction, and good afternoon, everyone. Thank you all for being here. Without much delay, I would like to begin. So if you can move to the next slide. So as we have just looked at the objectives, C. diff, Clostridioides difficile is truly a difficult organism, whether it is to treat or to diagnose or to manage or to prevent. It causes 500,000 infections in a year. And let's learn a little bit about this bacteria. It's a gram-positive, rod-shaped, spore-forming anaerobe, which causes disease through production of toxins, toxin A and toxin B. And that's why there is an inflammatory kind of a diarrhea. And the symptoms can actually range from completely asymptomatic patients to very severe and life-threatening disease, which is called fulminant disease, and many times leading to colectomy and even mortality. Moving on to the next slide. As you can see, the estimated deaths in 2017 were about 12,000 and costs up to 1 billion in a year. Clearly, it's an urgent threat to public health. Moving on. Let's look at the how C. diff stands as compared to all other GI infections. If you look at all other infections that we see in the hospital-acquired infections, C. diff accounted for about 12% in 2011 and about 15% hospital healthcare-associated infections in 2015, clearly an uptick. And if you look at GI infections, so you can see 70% accounted for C. diff, and in 2015, they went up to about 72%. So it is the most common cause of hospital-acquired diarrhea, and it does cause a lot of nuisance in the sense with the recurrence. It's a big problem, and the quality of life of our patients with recurrent C. diff deteriorates. Moving on. So let's look at the community-associated C. diff, whereas hospital-associated C. diff has sort of plateaued, but we are seeing that over the years, there is an actual uptick in the community-associated C. diff because of, again, increased antibiotic use in the community. And over the years, you can see the estimated burden in this particular graph. And antibiotics still remain the single most common risk factor for C. diff. And we are seeing more and more patients with community-associated C. diff, and even one exposure to one antibiotic at one particular point of time, like whether it is from their dentist, can lead to C. diff. Next slide, please. Now let's switch gears and talk a little bit about recurrent C. diff. So if you think of the rates of recurrent C. diff, they vary. They vary anywhere between 25 to 50%, depending on the host. And for example, in a person who's in a nursing home patient, their recurrent C. diff incidence can be as high as 50%. And again, if the patient gets admitted to the ICU for C. diff, their chances of recurrence are much higher. Now, if you look at what is the trouble with C. diff, with recurrent C. diff, that the incidence actually goes up with every recurrence, as you can see in this graph. This is a patient with index episode, and then you can see how you can see patients who have had sepsis from it and who have had to have colectomies because of recurrence. So you can see how it goes up. The morbidity associated with recurrent C. diff keeps going up with each episode, almost doubling, tripling. Moving on to the next slide. Let's look at the risk factors for C. diff. Like I said, antibiotics still remain single most common risk factor, but there are other risk factors. Age is a big risk factor. Age more than 65 years of age, like older adults, they have something called as immunosenescence. They cannot mount up the antibody responses to the toxins that are produced by C. diff, and that's why they are more likely to get recurrence. In addition to older age and antibiotics, other risk factors include immunosuppression, patients who are on steroids, patients who are getting bone marrow transplant, HIV patients. Having resided in a skilled nursing facility also puts them at higher risk. Patients exposed to PPIs and contact with active carriers. Having a recent C. diff infection is also a risk factor for recurrent C. diff. And like I said, the recurrence rates doubles with every episode of C. diff. As you can see in these green bars, this is first episode and then recurrence rates after that. Moving on to the next slide. Now that we've learned a little bit about the epidemiology, risk factors, outcomes, and costs associated with C. diff, let's go into the pathogenesis, what happens in our microbiome. We are more microbes than we are cells. And this is our diverse microbiome that we have, as you can see in this picture, but in this cartoon, but as they are exposed to antibiotics, that they lose that colonization resistance. When the normal microbiome becomes dysbiotic, it is more susceptible. And if that microbiome is exposed to C. diff spores, they will germinate in this dysbiotic microbiome to vegetative C. diff, and that's where the toxin will be produced and disease will be caused. Now, in a normal circumstance, if those antibiotics are removed and the patient doesn't get exposed to other risk factors of C. diff, they will eventually restore and recover a normal microbiome. But if a patient enters into this vicious cycle of recurrence because they are constantly exposed to either antibiotics or hospital environment or they're immunocompromised, they will never recover a normal microbiome. And they will remain in this state of dysbiosis. And this is a vulnerable stage. This is why they will always have that loss of colonization resistance, and they will enter into these episodes of recurrent C. diff. And that's why, one of the treatments is to restore this microbiome through fecal transplant, and which my friend Kevin will talk about. However, I just wanted to show through this cartoon what is it that happens in patients who have recurrent C. diff. And I think this is very instructive when we think about what is a normal microbiome and what is a dysbiotic microbiome. And there is a lot of research that is going on around microbiome, around metallobiome, and to learn more about our gut microbiome and how we can improve it through inclusion of diversity and diverse food choices to have a better microbiome. Moving on to the next slide. So like I said, we have 100 trillion organisms in the gut microbiome with more than 1,000 species, and diversity is essential to health. So eubiosis is where we want to be, because eubiosis helps us with immunity. It helps us with maintaining an epithelial barrier and colonization resistance. But when there is stress and diet changes or antibiotic exposure to steroids, we do enter into this dysbiosis. And this is exactly what is happening with C. diff. Moving on to the next slide. When we have patients who have recurrent C. diff, there are data that have looked at their microbiome. So, for example, in this graph, you can see a control C1, C2, C3 is a control. And the next 4 bars are showing you a patient with initial C. diff. And then the next 3 bars are C1, 2, and 3 are recurrent C. diff. So look at the diversity in these bars. So in a normal control, you see more firmicutes and bacteroides as a part of their microbiome. And in a patient with initial C. diff, you start seeing others, like you are seeing proteobacteria, you're seeing verruco microbiota. And then with recurrent C. diff, you are seeing more and more of less and less of bacteroides and firmicutes, but more and more of proteobacteria and verruco microbiota in those microbiomes. So Recurrent C. diff there is evidence that recurrent C. diff can alter the microbiome, the gut microbiome. And there's also data on how when you replace it and it never really comes back to its initial state, but it does get better and replenish with some good bacteria, so to speak. And there are various ways of understanding and measuring your gut microbiome through diversity. There is an alpha diversity index called Shannon's index that we look at, and we also look at richness when we look at our microbiome. So moving on to the next slide. We did talk a little bit about antibiotics, but I cannot stress this enough. Antibiotic use and then concomitant use of antibiotics when we are treating a patient with C. diff, that can also lead to a threefold increase in rates of recurrent C. diff. So, for example, this particular, in the first bar, you see no antibiotic exposure, the recurrence rate is 16%. But these are the patients in the second one. Antibiotics were given during treatment, 31% risk of recurrent C. diff, and 48% when antibiotics in 3 months post-treatment. So this is the effect of damaging the microbiome with antibiotic use. So cannot stress stewardship, antibiotic stewardship enough when it comes to preventing recurrent C. diff. Moving on to the next slide. So this is, I will, over to you, I am Dr. Anjan. Thank you again.
Thank you so much, Dr. Chopra, for that insightful yet alarming presentation. A quick reminder to our audience, please use the Q&A button to ask questions at any point in the presentation, and we'll try to get through some of your questions in the chat itself. Now, it is my pleasure to introduce our second speaker for today, the remarkable Dr. Kevin Gary, whose significant contributions have shaped the field of infectious diseases. Dr. Gary is a professor at the University of Houston College of Pharmacy and the chair of the Department of Pharmacy Practice and Translational Research. He's an adjunct professor at the University of Texas School of Public Health and a clinical specialist and researcher at Baylor St. Luke's Medical Center in Houston. He received a Bachelor of Science in Pharmacy degree from Dalhousie University in Halifax, Nova Scotia, Canada, a Doctor of Pharmacy from SUNY Buffalo in New York, and a Master of Science in Biometry from the University of Texas School of Public Health. Postdoctoral training included a pharmacy practice residency at Bassett Healthcare, Cooperstown, New York, and infectious disease specialty residency and fellowship training at the University of Illinois at Chicago. Dr. Gary is a fellow of the Infectious Diseases Society of America and a member of the IDSA and SHE practice guidelines for Clostridium difficile infection. He is an active member of the Society of Infectious Diseases Pharmacists and a fellow of the American Society of Health System Pharmacists and American College of Clinical Pharmacy. He has received several national awards, including the ASHP Best Practice Award in Health System Pharmacy Administration, the ASHP Drug Therapy Research Award, the SIDP Impact Paper in Infectious Diseases Pharmacotherapy Research Award, the ACCP Russell Miller Award, and the ASHP Sustained Contribution to Literature Award. Dr. Gary's research is supported by the National Institute of Health, the CDC, and the biotechnology industry. He has published over 275 manuscripts centered on clinical and translational research in healthcare-associated infections, including healthcare-related infections, candidemia, and Clostridium difficile infections. It's great having you here today, Dr. Gary. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Dr. Anjan, for that nice introduction. It's great to be here as part of C. diff Awareness Week, especially in the memory of Dr. Bartlett, who was an original discoverer of C. diff and obviously a giant in the field. So next slide. So I am tackling objectives 4 and 5 of this presentation. I'm going to focus a lot of my attention on the new live biotherapeutic products, which might be new to many or some in the room. And if you're really into this topic and are interested, IDSA recently published a supplement in CID around this topic, and many of the thoughts in this presentation are in this review article that I wrote with Ann Gonzalez Luna and Travis Carlson, open access, so Google it and you'll find it, no problem. All right, next slide. Okay, so when you think of therapeutic goals for C. diff infection, Tina really set it up nicely. You have to think about correcting that dysbiosis, getting the microbiome back to its original healthy state. It is an infectious disease, so you have to still kill the organism. And if you could augment your immune response to help your produce an antibody response to toxins A or B, that should be helpful as well. And so if you just click the button and go forward, you can quickly turn those therapeutic goals into treatment modalities. And you can also think about what you can do from a health systems perspective. So as Tina mentioned, you can really build your antimicrobial stewardship teams to best judiciously use antibiotics. This is a microbiome disrupting disease that is generally caused by antibiotics. So whatever you can do to limit the antibiotics that you're using, the better it is for C. diff. You can convince your P&T committees to use the very best antibiotics to kill C. diff. And the IDSA SHE guidelines recommend fidaxomicin first line. And if your P&T committee is not recommending it first line, you can certainly push that button. And then you can talk to your infusion centers. Actually, go back for a second. I just have a little more to talk about. You can talk to your infusion centers to set up bezotoximab. And that will be also another great strategy to prevent recurrent C. diff. But as that box mentions, the focus of my section is going to be on restore the microbiome. And I'm going to very specifically focus in on the new LPBs, Rebiota and Voust. And with that, advance the slide. Okay, great. So now these two products didn't even exist when the last IDSA SHE guidelines got together to think about where we should put microbiome replenishment therapy. So right now it's fecal microbiota transplantation considered after the second or subsequent recurrences based off a very big paper in the New England Journal of Medicine based in Europe, which enrolled exactly that, which showed very remarkable results from the use of FMT to prevent recurrent C. diff. So since that time, next slide, please. We had two brand new LPBs that have been FDA indicated and now are in clinical practice, ready for use. Lots and lots of different names for these things. RBX 2660 was the clinical trial designation number and name for what has now become brand name Rebiota, otherwise known as fecal microbiota live JSML. That is a mouthful, RBL being another acronym for it. SEER 109 now going by Voust, fecal microbiota spores live BRPK. I like the VOS because the S reminds me that's the spores one. They've both been on the market for over a year. They're both derived from healthy, normal donor feces, but Voust goes through another processing step, so you'll only get one component of the microbiome, firmicutes, and very specifically the spores of the firmicutes. The Rebiota is given via enema, which is the big distinguishing factor between that and Voust, which is given by capsules. Rebiota one time only, Voust for 3 days. And the rest of the sort of the administration is given below. It's a great reference that you can use when you're thinking about these products. Next slide. Okay, so welcome to the brand new world that didn't exist the last time IDSA SHE guidelines got together. What the heck are live biotherapeutic products, LPBs? And so they do have a very broad definition: non-vaccine biological products that contain live organisms applicable to the prevention, treatment, or cure of a disease or condition in humans. And that's applied in C. diff to prevent recurrent CDI. Now, they don't have any activity against C. diff itself, so you're still going to need an antibiotic. They're adjunctive therapy, but that's how LPBs are applied in C. diff. Okay, next slide. And so, okay, so they're live organisms. So then I've heard of probiotics before, and FMT I've seen. Now, how do they distinguish between these products? So a probiotic is essentially a food, any live microorganism that confers a health benefit when administered in adequate amounts. They're not regulated by the FDA. There's a variety of different compositions and a variety of different manufacturing processes. So they're not recommended by the IDSA SHA guidelines because they just haven't proven to be beneficial yet. Maybe because there isn't enough active drug in there, active bacteria. So FMT is regulated as a biological product by the FDA. You have to administer it under an IND and recommended in the guidelines to treat multiply recurrent C. diff. Now, an LPB is regulated as a drug. It has an indication and regulated as FDA. So it's recommended to prevent recurrent CDI following antibiotics. So probiotics we can somewhat move to the side, and let's dig a little deeper in FMT versus LPB. So that would be the next slide. And that FDA indication for the live biotherapeutics is really what it's all about. The donor screening is more rigorous. The sample screening has to go through good current manufacturing processes. The clinical trial is a phase 3 indication quality. The safety data is robust and growing. And the accessibility seems to be actually pretty good to begin with. Still, we need more real-world evidence. But those that have insurance or have special conditions appear to be able to get them easily enough. Next slide. Okay, so you can ask the question, well, what makes this so special? What's this good manufacturing process mean? And you have to be very healthy to become a donor for an LPB. So for Rebiota, it's derived from a single stool donor. So ironically enough, the dose you give to a patient will be able to be tracked back to the patient that gave the donation. They have to be healthy. They have a comprehensive physical exam. They test the stool for transmissible pathogens, and then they test them again even after they've left. Now, for Voust, young, healthy, skinny, in good shape, no medical history, free of everything, and you're starting to think sounds pretty good. Like Brandy Chastain or one of these soccer players. Woo, this is give me a piece of that. That sounds pretty good. So the screening process of this is really spectacular. Next slide. And so what are the concerns? What would be your safety concerns of putting a fecal microbiota product into your body? And if you think about it, what you're doing is taking this massive load of bacteria, microorganisms, and inserting them into your gut, where they're going to have this wonderful opportunity to start eating all the nutrients that they find in the gut. So if you guys have ever had the large salad at Salada, you'll know you'll have rumbly in the tummy when you're done, and you can just tell that the bugs in your gut are enjoying the food that they're now eating. Think of that similar with these FMT and microbiota replacement products. You're essentially just adding a lot of bacteria to the nutrients. So you're going to get a lot of abdominal discomfort, some gurgling, maybe a little bit of nausea. This would be just really the microbes establishing themselves in the milieu. Serious adverse effects are very rare. Probiotics are also associated with the similar types of side effects, but to a lesser extent, probably because there's just less bacteria in there. And by far and away, the most important risk is bloodstream infections, that you've forgotten to screen for something that this donor has, and then you transmit this pathogen into another person who's susceptible to a disease and cause that. That should go down way, way less because of the screening process I just described to you, and then all the other good manufacturing processes due to LPBs. All right, next slide. And I really like the RBX safety data because that really demonstrates this initial reconstitution of the microbes there. And so this is RBX, and you see 0 to 2. You do see a higher amount of mild to moderate adverse events. And that's really the microbes just reestablishing themselves in the gut. And then after that, they essentially become equal to placebo. And then go forward one more slide. And I really like the SEER data for this, just to show you in total how good these are in terms of placebo. And just read across any adverse event, AE, possibly related. And you can see that for SEER 109 placebo, those percentages, 93, 91, 51, 52, 88, 87, they really equal to placebo. So a safety profile very similar to placebo, though you may get some mild GI distress early in therapy. And next slide. Now, you will for sure put up with that safety profile because there has been remarkable decreases in recurrent C. diff with the use of these two LPBs. So this is the data on RBX 2660, Rebiata, where at 8 weeks, it went from 70.6%, your cure rates went up, 70.6% to 57.5% in those given placebo. And those results were sustainable, which was a remarkable finding, through 6 months. Because you remember, C. diff patients generally tend to get antibiotics again. And so the fact that this results have been sustainable from the clinical trials, at least for that long period of time, is very encouraging. Next slide, please. Similar again with CR109, and then up is good again. This is clinical response rates. And in this case, you see a good clinical response rate with CR109, 88%, and much lower with placebo, 60%. And within high-risk groups, in this case defined as age over 65, that's still beneficial. And it really didn't matter which initial antibiotic you used, fidaxomicin or vancomycin. So for those that can't get fidaxomicin, maybe vancomycin and CR109 is a choice to prevent recurrent C. diff. You always want to keep in your mind, how am I preventing recurrent C. diff? Next slide. And this is my second to last slide. This is something I've been very interested in is quality of life of C. diff patients, and especially with a patient advocate about to talk to us too. So there's what's called a C. diff 32. It's a C. diff specific quality of life instrument. And just put your eyes over to the CR109 section, and each of those graphs are pretty much the same. So just go to the very left of the first one and note that that's placebo. And the lighter blue is patients that didn't have recurrence. And the darker blue, that line going down, that's the patients who had recurrence. So you can see that when you have recurrent C. diff, your quality of life goes way down. That's what's illustrating to you there. And all the other subcomponents also go up or down to the C. diff 32. Now, go down one section to that second set of CR109 slides. That's actually the active drug. That's the CR109. And very remarkably, for the CR109 patients that didn't have recurrence, they had the quality of life improvement that you'd expect. But those that did, the few that did, still were able to improve their quality of life, meaning that microbiome replenishment might actually improve quality of life independent of just preventing recurrences, which was really a remarkable finding. And very similar with the RBX 2660 studies, in this case, none of these patients had recurrence. And you can see the red bars in this case are the RBX 2660 that are higher than placebo, even starting at week 1. So your quality of life improvement begins very, very quickly when you give these LPBs. That's what this is trying to illustrate. Okay, next slide. So when you're thinking of this, and you're thinking of giving it to a patient, you want to introduce these concepts to them, and then really the 2 different administration modes is really going to help you decide which one to use. You don't need any informed consent. It's an FDA indicated product, and then you discuss those initial side effects, which are usually mild. Next slide. To learn more and to learn how to pay for it, I don't know anything about this stuff, but I do know the websites are. Those are your 2 websites to go to in terms of reimbursement and help for patient advocacy type stuff. And I think last slide after that is just my big bang finish. So these are new products. They didn't exist last time the IDSA SHAE guidelines got together. So we'll have to get together with the guidelines again. And it's remarkable. You don't see these, a brand new class of pharmacologicals come on the market very, very soon. And they're safe and they're accessible if you have the right insurance. So when you're thinking of C. diff these days, really think of how am I going to prevent recurrence, and all these LPBs, bezilotoximab, fidaxomicin. There's plenty of choices to help you prevent that recurrent C. diff. So with that, Dr. Anjan, I'll turn it back to you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Gary. Personally, I think I learned a lot in this presentation about our current options. Now it's my pleasure to introduce our final speaker for today, our patient representative, in fact, Kiki Buckley. Kiki is a C. diff survivor and the recipient of the Peggy Lillis Foundation's 2022 Advocate Award. She is a member of their Advocates Council, is a co-author of the PLF's Nutrition and Lifestyle Guide, and has lobbied Congress numerous times for the passage of the PASTEUR Act. She has spoken at various conferences, including the World AMR Congress, Making a Difference in ID Conference, and the Share Spring Conference. She was a C. diff spokesperson for Ferring Pharmaceuticals and has blogged about her personal battle with C. diff and sepsis. She has also had the privilege of speaking about her experience at 3 different FDA hearings. Kiki is passionate about using her experience and voice to educate others about the dangers of antibiotic overuse, about the importance of a healthy gut microbiome, and to ensure the needs of C. diff sufferers are heard. Kiki is a New Jersey-based writer and filmmaker, and is a founding partner of Ad Hoc Media Partners, a production company that has several music and travel docuseries in various stages of production. Welcome, Kiki.
Thank you. Good afternoon, everyone. If we could go to the first slide, please. So this photo is of me and my grandma when I was 9 months old. And according to my mom, this was my very first time taking antibiotics, but it wasn't the last. Growing up, I was kind of a sickly kid, and I was on antibiotics 5 or more times every single year. I was conditioned to believe that antibiotics are like this magic pill that would quickly take care of any illness. And so as an adult, at the slightest sign of a cough or a cold, I'd beeline to my doctor for a prescription. Through my misguided effort to keep myself healthy through overusing antibiotics, my gut paid the price. I developed many food intolerances. I had SIBO, Candida, and IBS. Countless times I had to cancel social plans because I was laying in bed with an IBS attack with a heat pack on my belly. I considered myself a health and wellness enthusiast, and so it frustrated me to no end that I couldn't cure my gut issues through probiotics and my limited diet. Of course, for every step forward that I made in improving gut health, I took 2 steps back by taking yet another prescription. So fast forward to September of 2019, when my doctor prescribed a 10-day course of Levaquin for a sinus infection. A few days later, I had a routine colonoscopy screening. The following week, I saw my gastroenterologist, and I mentioned to her that my diarrhea hadn't stopped from my colonoscopy prep and that I had horrendous gut pain. Next slide, please. She ordered a stool test, and the next day phoned to tell me that I had tested positive for C. diff, something I had never heard of, and a diagnosis of which I didn't grasp the severity, especially when I asked her what C. diff was, and her response was, "Google it." Because C. diff is very contagious, I kicked my husband out of the bedroom, and I wore vinyl gloves when I was in the common areas of the house. I washed my hands constantly with soap and water because hand sanitizer doesn't kill C. diff. And if I used the bathroom or touched something, I cleaned with bleach because antiseptic wipes don't kill C. diff spores. I started a 10-day course of vancomycin, and I was afraid to leave the house because I never knew when I would need a bathroom. 5 days after I finished the first round of antibiotics, I relapsed, and it was worse this time. I had bad abdominal pain, was nauseous, and completely lost my appetite. Towards the end of my second course of vancomycin, I had a morning where I actually felt good enough to leave the house and do some errands. When I returned home, I took a sudden turn for the worse, and over the next hour, I vomited 5 or 6 times in addition to having diarrhea. I was lying on the bathroom floor in between episodes because I didn't have the strength to stand up. I was delirious with fever, and I was in the most pain I've ever felt, literally moaning with every breath. Next slide, please. My husband rushed me to the hospital where I was admitted and diagnosed with sepsis. And the shocking thing to me is how fast that happened. I went from in the morning getting a mani-pedi to in the evening, I was septic. I spent a week in isolation, and I don't remember much of my hospital stay. I was simultaneously on metronidazole, vancomycin, and fidaxomicin. My face and my limbs swelled. I had trouble breathing. I felt like I had a weight on my chest. I had blurred vision, brain fog, a vaginal yeast infection, and thrush that made my tongue look like a lion's mane and made it difficult to talk. I distinctly remember laying in my hospital bed wondering that if I was lucky enough to survive, How on earth would I ever fix my gut from the damage being done to it through both C. diff and the massive amounts of antibiotics being pumped into my body? I, at this point, was begging the doctors for a fecal microbial transplant, and I was told I wasn't eligible, even though I wasn't improving, despite being on 3 different antibiotics at the same time. After a week, I was deemed stable enough to be discharged. I had lost so much weight that my clothes were falling off of me, and I was on a tapered dose of vancomycin and fidaxomicin for the next month, only I didn't make it that long. 2 weeks later, I relapsed again. And at this point, my husband and I were so desperate to save my life that we were going to resort to self-administering an FMT at home using a blender, some saline, a turkey baster, and my husband as stool donor. Luckily, I saw my infectious disease doctor and I shared with her articles and clinical studies about fecal transplants. She had never had a patient have one, but she finally agreed that I was eligible. And within days, I had a life-saving FMT. It was truly a miracle, and it instantly cured me by restoring a healthy gut microbiome. And without an FMT, I genuinely believe I wouldn't be here talking with you today. A few weeks later, I had an infusion of bezotoximab to ensure that the C. diff wouldn't come back. Now, the silver lining of all of this is that my gut is now stronger than it has ever been in my adult life. My immune system is keeping me healthier, and I haven't used antibiotics in 6 years now. Most of my food intolerances have disappeared, and my food cravings have even changed. I've also had other unexpected benefits from the FMT. My thumb arthritis has almost completely disappeared. And this is amazing because pre-FMT, I had days when the pain was so bad that it hurt to button my shirt. My skin and my hair are healthier. And most surprisingly, the seasonal affective disorder that I was hit with in 2015 when I moved to New Jersey after spending 15 years in sunny Southern California has virtually vanished. C. diff and sepsis are tough things to bounce back from. And it did take me about 10 months to gain my weight back, to repair the damage that C. diff did to my colon, to shake the brain fog, and to get my energy and strength back. There's also the emotional recovery. Patients feel dirty and disgusting. There's a stigma surrounding the word diarrhea and a sense of shame talking about it, which incidentally is ridiculous when you consider that pooping is just as much as a natural bodily function as breathing. And many C. diff sufferers or survivors develop long-term problems like IBS, colitis, or Crohn's disease. And a lot of survivors, like me, have anxiety about ever going on antibiotics again. For years before I contracted C. diff, I had read articles about the importance of not overusing antibiotics and about the dangers of antibiotic resistance. But even so, the inconvenience of being sick always outweighed my concerns about hypothetical deadly antibiotic resistant superbugs that would never affect me. But then one did get me, and it got me good. Over the past 6 years, my doctors have wanted to prescribe antibiotics to me for several times for sinus infections, asthmatic bronchitis, and even recently when I had my first root canal a few weeks ago. Each time, I gave my body the opportunity to heal itself. It likely took far longer to get better without the help of antibiotics, but I did it on my own. I got better, and my good gut bacteria stayed intact and at the ready to keep me healthy and strong. Our immune systems are smart, and in many cases, they know what to do if we just give them the time to do their jobs. I'd like to end this by encouraging everyone to be aware of the dangers of antibiotic overuse, to understand how gut health can boost one's immune system, and to always remember that the simple act of washing hands with soap and water can mean the difference between life and death. Thank you. And back to you, Dr. and John.
Thank you. Thank you, Kiki, for being so vulnerable and sharing your story with us. That's a really tough road, and I'm glad you're here as our patient advocate right now. So now if you can stay online, and if Doctors Chopra and Gary can please unmute and turn on your video for the Q&A portion of the webinar. I found a few questions that we could go over live. So I think the first question, I'll start probably for Dr. Chopra and then Dr. Gary. In clinical practice, how is the microbiome measured? How is dysbiosis identified, and how is it treated? Is there a way to measure
Sure.
this?
Yeah, so in clinical practice, we don't routinely measure microbiome, but yes, we have ways to look at the microbiome for research purposes. So what like I was mentioning earlier, we have something called as a Shannon's diversity index to look at the diversity of the microbiome. Once we collect the stool and do PCR analysis on it and be able to sequence various good and bad bacteria in the gut microbiome. But this is not something that is routinely offered for patients.
Dr. Gary, in your experience for clinical or research purposes, is there a way to quantify, measure, or describe the microbiome?
Well, there certainly is. Clinically, is like, do you see VRE overgrowth, for example? And that you shouldn't have a whole bunch of VRE in your microbiome. And so you have signals that someone has an altered microbiome. Also, if you have pre-existing use of a lot of antibiotics that target anaerobes, that's going to be a massive signal that this person has a disrupted microbiome. And then as Tina says, I think the real science is coming online that's going to tell you what your alpha diversity is, what's your proportion of taxa. I think that those diagnostics are coming, but they're certainly not here yet.
Understood. Thank you. The second question we have, I'll start with Dr. Chopra. I have had patients clinically fail fidaxomicin and subsequently respond to vancomycin. Is there a possible mechanism that can describe that?
So fail vancomycin and respond to fidaxo, or fail fidaxomicin? I see.
Fail fidaxo and respond to vanc.
Yeah, I personally have not had this experience that they failed fidaxomicin, because based on literature and evidence and the literature and trials with fidaxomicin, what we know is that fidaxomicin, if it is used for the initial episode, it actually helps prevent recurrent disease. And also the fact that fidaxo is less broad acting as compared to vanco. It's more, it is more protective, so to speak, for the microbiome. So I haven't seen that, but I'm curious to know if, Kevin, you have any experience with failure of fidaxo, but then response to vanco.
I would say, like, if you think of clinical trials, 80% response rates for both agents for the initial clinical cure. So it's not a big surprise that a person may fail one and respond to the other. That'd be my first thought. There is resistance out there. We've demonstrated with vancomycin non-susceptibility that cure rates go down. And there's certainly isolated case reports of fidaxomicin out there. So that's concerning. And then last but not least, at least initially, and I still think now, when we give someone fidaxomicin, a lot of times it's the more sick, more severe, let's give this person the really good one because they're really sick. And we have to remember those are the persons that are most likely to fail. And so there's a bias towards, I saw the failure with fidaxomicin, because you're giving it to the person that's more likely to fail more often. So just got to keep that in the back of your mind too when you think about this stuff.
That makes sense. Thank you. Moving on to our next question. When treating patients for recurrence and want to start LBPs, on what day of the antibiotic regimen should one start? Or do you wait until the end of therapy with antibiotics? I think, Dr. Gary, this would be a good one for you to answer.
That's a good one and a quick one. You do wait till you stop, because obviously the antibiotics could just kill the LPB and you would waste a lot of money. And then go back to my slide. In case I quote it wrong, there's a certain amount of time, 2 to 3 days, that you have to wait before you give the LPB.
Yeah, I think 72 hours usually want to wait.
You're more courageous than I am, Tina. That would be my guess as well.
Got it. Okay, so wait until the completion of antibiotics. Good. Thank you. Interesting. I think a question for both Dr. Chopra and Dr. Gary. C. diff is not routinely cultured or tested for susceptibility. To what extent is the first recurrence thought to be due to failure of vancomycin or fidaxomicin to eradicate the pathogen, or dysbiosis and failure to restore gut microbiome?
I'm happy to go first, Kevin. So yes, we don't routinely look at susceptibilities, but recurrence, when we are seeing recurrence, it's usually the fact that we still have spores that are germinating and causing disease, and patient has dysbiosis, and there is either the patient has not recovered or is repeatedly exposed to antibiotics or other risk factors which are causing them to have recurrence. They could have old age, they could have exposure to the hospital environment, they could have a bone marrow transplant. So those could be the risk factors for the dysbiosis. And now it also depends on what they were given earlier to treat C. diff. Now, I don't see a lot of Flagyl being used anymore, but I always say I have kept Flagyl in the museum, so I hope that nobody is using metronidazole as a prelim choice. But when we were seeing a lot of metronidazole earlier, we would see a lot of recurrence because of clearly evidence against use of Flagyl. But if the patient was given either Vanco or Fidaxo, yet they recurred, that could be because they have dysbiosis, they are in a state of dysbiosis. So you want to either use various therapies like Kevin pointed out. You could prolong treatment, you could have tapered vancomycin, or even have prolonged treatment or repeat it until the patient can recover from it, or resort to other choices. So yes, like Kevin had pointed out, there is a chance of failure from both Vanco and Fidaxo, given the fact that the host has dysbiosis.
And I can just quickly add 2 cents to that. Absolutely, it's a disrupted microbiome that causes recurrence. That's mechanistically understanding. That's what Tina presented to us. That's why bezilotoximab, which is adjunctive, has no antimicrobial activity, prevents it. So that's a absolutely. Now, could AMR, antimicrobial resistance, also contribute to initial clinical failure and recurrence? I think that's a strong maybe. I think it's for sure clinical cure can be impacted, especially with vancomycin, and by extension, then probably recurrence as well.
Got it. Thank you, Dr. Gary. We actually have a few questions in the chat about this. How do LBPs compare to bezilotoximab in recurrent C. diff?
Maybe I'll tackle that one first and then get Tina's thoughts too. 2 very distinct mechanisms of action, which is what I think is so fascinating. So one is used if you fail to mount a good immune response to toxin B, bezilotoximab. The other one is if you have a very disrupted microbiome so that you need microbiome replenishment therapy. And then they're both very effective at preventing recurrence. So then who doesn't mount a good immune response? Well, that's age. So age over 65 is one of those magical cut points, but the older, the more likely you are. So if you have an aged patient who hasn't had a whole lot of pre-existing antibiotic exposure, Bezlo. If you have a ton of pre-existing antibiotics, almost regardless of age, but especially if they're younger, well, that's LPB land. So knowing the mechanism and then knowing the pathophysiology helps you make really good rational decisions.
Absolutely agree with Kevin. And sometimes we have to use both, especially in our bone marrow transplant patients. So absolutely, it's the mechanism that is going to drive the decision how to do it. Yeah.
Thank you. Dr. Chopra, a follow-up question. You know how we hesitate from giving any live bacteria to immunocompromised hosts? Has that been a problem in your BMT patients? The hesitancies they fear in your transplant teams and giving LMPs to their patients?
I actually have not had that problem, especially because the way these LBPs are formulated, they are, we have FDA approved products that we use. For example, Rebiota, we have used in immunocompromised patients. They are FDA approved, and the ease of administering it. And like we heard from our patient advocate, how it improves the quality of life. So actually, in my hospital, I have patients asking for it. And Kevin, over to you.
I'll just say ditto.
Got it. Okay, that makes sense. So I have some answers for our transplant team when this comes up next time. Are the LVPs ever utilized inpatient, or are these strictly outpatient only? I think it's a implementation question. Dr. Chopra or Dr. Gary, whoever feels comfortable answering this.
We are using it strictly outpatient, also for reimbursement purposes. So we are only strictly using it outpatient.
Yeah, and there's no rush. The vast majority of patients with C. diff leave the hospital with an antibiotic, with a C. diff directed antibiotic. And so you can't give the product until you finish your course of antibiotic therapy. So for us too, it's universally outpatient.
Got it. Thank you. The follow-up to that is any advice on how to operationalize this in institutional settings, such as an outpatient GI clinic?
I'll start this one. You need a champion. Just because there's not a zillion patients that need this, but the ones that do need a lot of care and attention, and you need someone in your system to be the champion, so everyone knows to go to that person, and then they know all the bells and whistles of how to get it and the patient assistance programs and all that kind of stuff.
Yeah, I agree. And also it involves some paperwork. So you need to have a dedicated nurse who can help you with some of the paperwork, how to order the product, and have a clinic time and space that is reserved for this reason. And also somebody who can actually explain all of that to the patient and their family and what precautions they have to take and things like that. So logistically, having a protocol in place, I would really advise that, you create, when you are just starting off, you want to create a protocol, you want to create a policy for your clinic, you want to have a team that is going to, together with the nurse, you are going to be a good advocate for your patient, and especially knowing the fact that this is going to be such beneficial for the patient and their quality of life.
Got it. Thank you, Dr. Chopra. I think this could be a question for you, Dr. Chopra. And what is your opinion on extended taper vancomycin versus an off-label extended taper of fidaxomicin for recurrent C. diff infection?
Yeah, I have used extended taper vancomycin for my patients, and it has many a times it has worked. So I do try to do that as an early option. I've not used as much fidaxomicin in my practice, but I know of physicians who do use fidaxotaper as well. But usually, given the cost, I usually go with vanco, and then if it doesn't work, then I go on to LBP.
Thank you.
And I one thought, there is what's called the Extend trial with fidaxomicin. You give the same number of pills, but you give a normal course for 5 days, and then every other day, then you give it. So it's a 25-day course of therapy. It's a European study, randomized controlled trial, but open label. But they showed remarkably low recurrence rates with this Extend trial. So if you just went Extend and fidaxomicin, you bump into it. And it's if someone fails standard course fidaxomicin, it's another next one to consider in that particular case.
Understood. Thank you, Dr. Gary. So the Extend trial, I'll put that in the chat as well. So I think we have time for one more question. This is tricky. So thoughts on, I think this question is for secondary prophylaxis. Any thoughts on using vancomycin PO for secondary prophylaxis in high-risk patients on broad-spectrum antibiotics in the hospital? Is there data to support it?
I can start. I don't like it, first and foremost. Everything that Tina talked about, the microbiome disruption, is based off of use of vancomycin. It is really, really disruptive to the microbiome. So while you're giving that secondary prophylaxis, you may be preventing C. diff because it's got great activity against C. diff. But when you stop and the vancomycin's gone, you've now created a human being who's really, really susceptible to C. diff. Like, you're not above all, do no harm. Like you're doing harm. And so it's a pedestal topic for me, but I'm not a fan of that one little bit.
Okay. All right. With that, we have come to the end of our presentation. Thank you so much, Dr. Chopra, Dr. Gary, and Kiki for joining us here today and sharing your story. I will hand it back to Amanda.
Thank you. And thank you so much, Dr. Chopra and Gary, for your insightful and valuable presentations. Very, very great and very well put together. Kiki, thank you for your sharing the impact that overuse of antibiotics and C. diff have had on you personally. And thank you, Dr. Anjan, for moderating again. Your participation was deeply valued. Thank you to our audience for your attendance and participation in the Q&A session. If you wish to revisit the webinar or share it with others, a recording will be made available to you via email and on our website and YouTube channel. And save the date for our important upcoming webinar in honor of World AIDS Day. We will be discussing advancing HIV prevention, strategies, treatment, and community impact. Additionally, if you are an art enthusiast or an art collector, don't miss our virtual art auction. Bid on stunning artwork created and generously donated by Dr. Anna Velez, an accomplished artist and ID physician. Finally, if you're interested in becoming a member of the Infectious Diseases Society of America, please don't hesitate to reach out to us or visit the IDSA website at idsociety.org. Thank you again and have a wonderful rest of your day. Bye-bye.